corner office on the 14th floor of Caldwell Freight overlooked Halifax Harbor under a January sky the color of old pewter. Margaret Voss stood behind a glass desk with both hands flat on the surface, her chin level, her voice steady. "Mr. Holt," she said, "the company cannot carry an employee who refuses to respect shift start times. Your contract ends today, effective immediately." Thomas Holt stood 2 steps from the edge of the desk. Dark green work jacket, steel-toed boots, shoulders that had learned to stay square through worse rooms than this one. He did not ask why, he did not raise his voice. He looked at her for exactly 3 seconds, not angry, not wounded, only the way a man memorizes something he does not intend to forget. Then he nodded once, turned, and walked out. The door closed behind him with a soft click. Margaret stood very still, her hands did not move from the glass, and for reasons she could not name, her fingers pressed harder against the surface, as though the desk might drift away beneath her. To understand why Thomas Holt said nothing, you need to go back 9 hours. At 4:45 in the morning, the kitchen of a rented duplex on Gottingen Street smelled like coffee and burnt toast. Thomas stood at the counter in a clean work shirt, spreading peanut butter across a slice of bread while the radio played low in the background. The door to the small bedroom at the end of the hall opened, footsteps. Then a girl appeared in the kitchen doorway, 7 years old, hair tangled from sleep, holding a purple sock in each hand with the earnest expression of someone who had been betrayed by laundry. "Daddy," said June, "one of these has a hole." Thomas crouched down and looked at both socks with appropriate seriousness. "That one's a ventilated sock," he said, "very advanced." June considered this. "Does that mean cold air comes in?" "It means your foot breathes." She thought about it for another 2 seconds and then pulled both socks on and went to find her shoes. Thomas had been raising June alone for 4 years, since the morning a social worker from Dartmouth knocked on his door with a small girl in a yellow raincoat and the news that his sister was not coming back. He had been 31 years old, working night freight at the port, living in a 1-bedroom apartment with a second-hand couch and a coffee maker that only worked if you hit it twice on the left side. He had not planned for any of it. He had not planned for the way June would reach for his hand the first time they walked to the corner store together, or for the way she would fall asleep on the couch with her cheek on his arm, or for the way he would find himself rearranging his entire life around the fact that she existed and needed him to show up. He showed up, every day, without exception. That morning, Fairview Elementary held their annual winter Reading breakfast. Parents were invited from 7 to 8:30. Thomas had arranged to arrive at work by 9. His shift started at 8. He had spoken to his supervisor 3 weeks earlier and confirmed the time. What he did not know was that his supervisor had changed 2 months ago. The gymnasium smelled like orange juice and cinnamon rolls. June introduced him to her teacher, to her reading partner Anika, and to a boy named Sam who had apparently set the class record for most library books signed out in November. Thomas sat beside his daughter at a long folding table and listened to her read aloud from a chapter book about a girl who discovers her grandmother is secretly a lighthouse keeper. June was not a fast reader. She was a careful one. She read each sentence like it was worth something. At 8:43, Thomas checked his watch. June reached over and covered it with her hand without looking up from the page. He stayed until the last paragraph. 7 kilometers across the harbor, Margaret Voss had been in the building since 6:15. She was 39. Dark blazer, hair pinned at the nape of her neck, the kind of posture that came from growing up in a household where slumping was treated as a moral failing. 14 months earlier, her father had died of a stroke in this same building, in this same office, and had left Caldwell Freight to her over the objections of a board that had expected it to go to someone else. That someone else was a man named Gerald Price, 54 years old, silver hair, a handshake that arrived before the rest of him. He had spent 22 years maneuvering to inherit a company that had never actually been his. And when the will was read, he had smiled with his mouth while his eyes did something else entirely. Halfway through the morning operations review, Price slid a printed report across the conference table. "A staffing concern," he said mildly, "before we move on to the port expansion numbers." He did not look at Margaret when he said it. Every other person in the room did. The report listed 8 late arrivals over 6 weeks, all attributed to one employee, Thomas Holt, dock operations. Price's own signature was at the bottom of the summary. Margaret read it. "I'll address it today," she said. She did not look at him either. Thomas pulled into the Caldwell lot at 9:17. He nodded to the woman at the security booth, parked in his usual spot near the loading dock, and walked inside. There was a message on the terminal at his station. Ms. Voss would like to see you on the 14th floor at your earliest convenience. He opened his locker. He took out the photograph of June that he kept clipped to the inside of the door. June at Peggy's Cove in August, windburned and squinting into the sun, holding up a starfish she'd named Gerald for reasons she declined to explain. He put the photograph in his chest pocket. He closed the locker. He did not slam it. Upstairs, the termination took 4 minutes. Thomas sat across from Margaret and answered her questions with 3 words or fewer. When she said the company needed to maintain consistent standards, he nodded. When she slid the separation agreement across the desk, he read it. He signed it. He stood. "Thank you for your time, Ms. Voss," he said. He walked out. Margaret reached for her water glass after the door closed and found her hand was not entirely steady. She set the glass down without drinking from it and told herself this was discipline. This was what a consistent standard looked like. The board needed to see her act decisively. She said this quietly to the window in the harbor below. The harbor did not respond. Downstairs, Thomas packed his locker into a small canvas bag. The photograph of June, a rain jacket, a granola bar he had been meaning to eat for 2 weeks. The dock supervisor, a man named Roy LeBlanc, 61 years old, a knee that had been replaced and a back that probably should be, was standing near the freight elevator when Thomas came out. Roy looked at his watch. He looked at Thomas. He gave one slow nod, the kind that did not require a word. Thomas nodded back. He walked through the loading bay, past the yellow safety lines he had repainted himself 6 months ago, and out into the January cold. He sat in his truck in the far corner of the lot with the engine running for warmth. He opened his wallet and unfolded a receipt from the pharmacy on Quinpool Road. On the back, he wrote 3 numbers. 11,000 and change in savings, 4 months of rent, June's skating lessons through March. He looked at the numbers for a long time. Then he folded the receipt back into his wallet and drove to Point Pleasant Park. He walked the trails for 2 hours. The ground was frozen solid, the harbor flat and gray between the trees. He did not cry. He had used up that particular resource 4 years ago, in a parking lot outside a courtroom in Dartmouth, after a guardianship order and a social worker handed him a car seat he did not know how to install. He had called his mother that night, and she had talked him through the car seat buckle over the phone, and at some point he had started crying and she had just kept talking, calm and steady, until he was done. He called her now from the park. She was in Truro. She said she could come and get June from school if he needed her. He said no, he had it. He thanked her. He hung up and stood by the water for another 20 minutes and then drove home to start calling about other jobs. At 1:10 that afternoon, Gerald Price walked into Margaret's office and stood with his hands behind his back, looking satisfied in the way of a man who has just won a bet he did not admit to making. "Well handled," he said. "The port clients will take note." Margaret did not look up from her screen. "Thank you, Gerald." He left. She stared at the door for a moment after it closed. Then she picked up her phone and started reading emails. By 6 o'clock, she was reviewing contract renewals. By 7, the cleaning staff had come and gone. By 7:45, she was driving north along the McKay Bridge in a light freezing rain, the kind that coats everything in a thin glaze and makes the city look fragile. At 8:03, her car fishtailed on a patch of black ice near the Bedford Highway overpass and died against the guardrail with a sound like a closing argument. She was not hurt. The car was a different matter. She turned the ignition 3 times. Nothing. She called roadside assistance. 60 to 90 minutes. She stepped out to check the front end. The rain had thickened. Her coat was wool, which is to say it was useless. She stood on the shoulder and counted the cars that slowed, then did not stop. She lost count after 16. Her phone said 9% battery. 1 bar of signal. Her heels were not made for ice. She had been standing on the shoulder for 22 minutes, getting incrementally colder, when she heard a truck slow behind her and pull to the gravel. The door opened. A man stepped out into the rain. Dark green work jacket. Broad shoulders. He walked toward her through the freezing drizzle with the unhurried pace of someone who has stopped being surprised by inconvenience. He saw her face. She saw his. Neither of them moved for 3 seconds, the same 3 seconds as the office. But out here on the bridge shoulder with the rain coming sideways, something in the balance had shifted entirely. "Ms. Voss," he said. His voice was level. She opened her mouth. No words came. "How long has it been off?" 22 minutes. Her voice came out smaller than she expected. He walked around to the front of the car and opened the hood. He stood under it for 90 seconds with his phone light and the rain on his jacket. When he came back, he spoke matter-of-factly. Front axle, nothing repairable on the shoulder. He was headed to Sackville, he said. He could take her downtown first. There was no rideshare service reliable on this stretch. Not tonight. He unzipped his jacket. He held it out. She did not take it. You're soaked through, Ms. Voss. He did not look at her when he said it. He looked at the guardrail. It's just a jacket. She put it on. It was heavier than she expected, still warm. She climbed into the passenger seat. There was a booster seat in the back with a purple into the cup holder and a library book on the floor, the one about the grandmother and the lighthouse. A small pair of snow boots was pushed under the seat. My niece, Thomas said as he got in. I picked her up from my mother's an hour ago. She's at home now. She thought of a girl reading careful sentences while her father watched the clock and stayed anyway. She turned her face to the window. For the next 19 minutes, Thomas drove 5 kilometers under the limit. No hard stops, no sharp turns. The defroster ran steady. The radio was off. There was only the sound of freezing rain on the windshield and the wet hiss of the bridge grates beneath the tires. Margaret sat with the jacket across her shoulders. It smelled like winter and motor oil and something honest, the smell of a person who worked with their hands and did not pretend otherwise. She thought of the signed separation agreement in her desk drawer and felt the question take shape in her chest, heavy and specific. What did I do this morning? Who is this man? At 8:41 he stopped on Barrington Street outside her building, left the engine running. She reached for the jacket. Keep it, he said. Return it whenever. No hurry. She looked at him. He was looking through the windshield, hands on the wheel, not making it into a moment. She got out. Before she closed the door, she said the only thing she said the whole drive. Thank you, Thomas. He nodded once. He drove away. She stood on the front steps of her building in the freezing rain with his jacket over her shoulders and watched the truck's taillights disappear around the corner. She did not go inside. She stood there for a long time. And then she did something she had not done since the afternoon of her father's funeral. She sat down on the wet granite step in a $2,000 blazer in freezing rain and cried. She did not know yet what she was going to find in the morning. She did not sleep. By 5:45 she was already in the elevator. The Caldwell Freight Board of Directors met 4 times a year. The third quarter session was scheduled for 9 o'clock. The first board member to arrive at 7 was a woman named Dr. Constance Alder, 70 years old, former Deputy Minister of Transportation for Nova Scotia. A person who had spent 43 years making careful decisions and never learned to make a careless one. She came off the elevator, walked past the staff directory screen in the reception area and stopped. On the screen, contract terminated, Thomas Holt, dock operations. Dr. Alder stood there for 10 seconds. Then she turned to the receptionist. Does Ms. Voss know who this man is? The receptionist blinked. I'm not certain what you mean. That, said Dr. Alder, is the answer. She asked to see Margaret before the board session, privately. 7 kilometers away, Thomas was making oatmeal. June sat at the kitchen table in her snowsuit because she had announced she was cold and the snowsuit was the warmest thing she owned. She was drawing a dog that she planned to name Gerald for reasons that remained consistent with her earlier logic. Thomas had not told her yet about the job. He would tell her tonight. He had not worked out the words. 20 minutes later, in the corner office overlooking the harbor, Margaret sat across from Dr. Constance Alder, who did not take coffee and did not take long to get to the point. The man whose name was on your termination screen this morning, Dr. Alder said. Master Corporal Thomas Holt, Canadian Army, 3rd Battalion Royal Canadian Regiment. He deployed to Kandahar in 2009 as a logistics specialist. He was decorated for organizing a supply evacuation under fire when the convoy vehicle broke down. He volunteered for a second tour when he did not have to. He came home, took on guardianship of his niece, and apparently landed at Caldwell Freight, where someone decided he was expendable. She set her hands in her lap. I imagine you had your reasons. I'd like to understand them. Margaret slid the price report across the desk. Dr. Alder looked at it without picking it up. After a moment she said, before this board session, I would encourage you to pull the raw attendance records, not the summary, the primary source data, and I would suggest you do it without involving your chief operations officer. She stood. At the door she paused. Your father hired me to this board because he said I read a room better than anyone he'd met. He also hired Holt, I'd wager, because he read a person the same way. She looked at Margaret steadily. Trust what you saw last night, Miss Voss. She left. Margaret sat with the phrase last night turning over in her chest like a stone in cold water. She buzzed her assistant. She asked for every primary attendance record on Thomas Holt, not summaries, raw data. Everything the system held. Her HR coordinator, a woman named Bet Szymanski, 55 years old, careful eyes behind bifocals, 20 years of watching things and writing nothing down until it mattered, arrived 11 minutes later with a folder and a USB drive. I've been keeping this, Bet said. For a while, the data was unambiguous. For 6 weeks, Thomas Holt had arrived at the loading dock between 7:40 and 8:05, not once after 8:15, except one morning, the morning she had fired him at 9:17, because he had been at his niece's school reading breakfast. Price's summary had listed 8 late arrivals. The raw data showed one. Margaret pulled up the system access log. Gerald Price had signed into the attendance database 11 times in 6 weeks. Each time within 18 hours of submitting a summary to her office, he had been modifying the records directly. She walked to the window. Below, the harbor moved gray and slow in the January cold. A container ship was being guided by tugboats. She watched them until she understood what she needed to do. 6 kilometers away, Thomas was warming soup on the stove. June sat at the kitchen counter with her drawing pad. She had been drawing dogs for the past hour. There were 7 dogs, and Gerald was the best of them. Thomas had looked at all 7 with the gravity they deserved and ranked them aloud, which had made June very serious and then very pleased. He had his phone in his hand. He had not called anyone yet about other work. He had picked it up 3 times and put it back down when June came into the kitchen. He was not sure why he was waiting. He told himself it was just a matter of finding the right moment. In her office, Margaret opened the bottom drawer of her desk. Inside was a sealed envelope. Thomas Holt's termination letter, typed, signed, time-stamped. She had not yet sent it to his address on file. She held it for a long time. She thought about signing a document without understanding what she was signing. She thought about 11 attendance records that did not match a single early morning she had fabricated herself. She set the envelope back in the drawer and left it unsealed. Bet was still standing near the filing cabinet. Bet, Margaret said, how long have you known the records were altered? The older woman took her time answering. I knew they'd been touched. I didn't know by whom. She folded her hands. Your father told me once when I was new here and I made a payroll mistake, that the only difference between a company that lasts and a company that doesn't is whether the truth can be found when it needs to be. I took that seriously. Margaret nodded slowly. I owe him an apology. You owe a few people several things, Bet said. But yes, him first. She left. Margaret sat at her desk until the cleaning staff came through at 8 o'clock. The termination envelope sat in the drawer. The harbor lights came on outside. She thought she understood the situation clearly now. She was wrong. There was one more person in the building who had been waiting to be asked. He knocked on her office door at 6:40 the next morning. She had not left. She was still in yesterday's blazer. His name was Roy LeBlanc. He held a small wire-bound notebook in both hands, the kind sold at corner drugstores, the cover bent to the flag page. Each line was a date and a time, handwritten, steady, block printing. January 6th, 7:43, January 7th, 7:51, January 7th, 7:39, January 9th, 7:46. Holt's dock check-in times, Roy said. I keep a log on every person who runs a shift under me. Started doing it 28 years ago when I was a foreman in Moncton. A supervisor I respected told me that the people who come early are the ones you build the operation around. Wrote it down so I'd remember. He pointed to 3 flagged entries. These 3 days here, the 15th, 18th, and 22nd of last month, listed in that report as 3 of his late arrivals. Each one of those mornings, Holt came in 2 hours early and covered my shift because my knee had gone out during the cold snap. He worked his full day on top of it. Those aren't late arrivals, Ms. Voss. Those are 20-hour days. He closed the notebook and set it on her desk. I've had this ready for 3 weeks, he said. I just needed someone to ask me for it. At the door he stopped and turned back. He never told me much about himself. I found out he'd served because his niece wore a little poppy pin to the Remembrance Day thing we did for the dock staff. Same pin you see in a photograph he kept in his locker. He noticed me looking at it. He didn't say anything. Roy paused. He just nodded. That was the only conversation I've ever had with him that wasn't about freight. He let himself out. Margaret picked up her phone. By 9:30, the IT director had confirmed the access log. 11 modifications to the attendance file, all from Price's administrator account, in a 6-week window. By 10:45, the corporate counsel had produced a disclosure summary. Gerald Price held a 12% stake in a third-party logistics firm, undisclosed for 19 months, the same firm currently bidding on Caldwell's Halifax terminal expansion contract. At noon, Margaret called the number listed in Thomas's personnel file. He answered on the second ring. "Holt, Thomas." She stopped. "Start it. It's Margaret Voss. I'd like to come by this afternoon if that's all right. There are things I need to say to you in person." A pause, 3 seconds, the kind she was already beginning to recognize, not hesitation, but the particular silence of a person who thinks but before they speak. "That's fine," he said. "June gets home from school at 3:30. He hung up. Margaret held the phone for a moment, then she sat on the edge of her desk. And for the first time in 14 months, she let herself take a full breath. At 4 o'clock, she stood on the front step of a duplex on Gottingen Street, holding a manila envelope. Inside it, a reinstatement letter, a letter of personal apology handwritten on plain paper, and a copy of the legal summary on Gerald Price. She had written the apology 3 times before she had written it right. The door opened before she knocked. June stood in the doorway in a snowsuit, because she was still cold, holding a marker in one hand and looking up at Margaret with an expression of careful assessment. "You have his jacket," June said. Margaret looked down. She was wearing it over her coat. She had not thought about it. "You were the lady in the car in the rain," June said. "Dad told me he helped someone. He didn't say it was you." She stepped back and held the door open. "You can come in." The apartment was small and warm and clean in the way that takes deliberate effort. A couch with a folded blanket, a kitchen table with a booster seat pushed up to it, drawings on the refrigerator held by magnets, a careful grid of them, dogs, houses, a lighthouse, a girl standing on ice with 2 purple mittens raised. On the shelf by the window, a photograph of a woman who looked like neither Thomas nor June but shared something in her eyes with the child. Thomas came out of the kitchen with a dish towel over his shoulder. He looked at Margaret. He did not look surprised. "Miss Voss." "Margaret," she said. He gestured to the table. She set down the envelope. She sat. June climbed onto chair, uncapped her marker, and began drawing without appearing to listen, which meant she was listening to everything. "The records were falsified," Margaret said. "All of them. Price modified the database directly, 11 times over 6 weeks. He also holds an undisclosed stake in the logistics firm bidding on our terminal expansion. The board meets Thursday morning. He doesn't know yet that I know." She slid the envelope across the table. Thomas did not pick it up. "I came here," she said, "not because the board will require me to address this, not because Dr. Alder is watching. I came because you deserve to hear it from the person who signed the document in your home without an audience." Thomas looked at her across the table for a long moment. He picked up the dish towel and folded it. He set it down. "I'll make tea," he said. He went back to the kitchen. June looked up from her drawing. She patted the floor beside her chair. Margaret, who had not sat on anyone's floor since before law school, since before the Blazers and the board meetings and the harbor views, set down her coat and sat down on the floor of an apartment on Gottingen Street. June showed her the drawings in order. The dogs first, 7 of the best, which June confirmed with the seriousness of a judge. Then the lighthouse drawing, which was for a school project. Then a drawing of a girl standing in a backyard in the snow with a man behind her and a small tree they had planted. The tree had no leaves. June had given it 3 branches and a small red star at the top, which she explained was going to be the first bud in spring. "How do you know it'll bud red?" Margaret asked. "Dad says red maples always do," June said. "He says if you plant the right one and wait, you'll always know when it's spring." From the kitchen came the sound of the kettle and then the slow sound of water being poured. Then Thomas was standing in the doorway with 2 mugs and looking at them there on the floor, his niece explaining something to this woman who was sitting cross-legged beside her chair. He stood for a moment without speaking. Then he set one mug beside the manila envelope he had not yet opened and came and sat down on the other side of June, and the 3 of them stayed there until the tea had gone cold and June had fallen asleep sideways against his arm. He carried her down the hall to her room. When he came back, Margaret was still on the floor, her back against the couch, the empty mug at her knee. "You didn't have to come in person," he said from the doorway. "I know," she said. He nodded. He didn't say anything else. The boardroom on Thursday morning was full. 7:15. 12 members of the Caldwell Freight Board sat around the long oval table. Dr. Constance Alder was at the far end. Gerald Price sat at Margaret's right in a new suit with a pocket square the color of ice. He smiled at her as she set down her folder. She did not smile back. "Before we open the expansion discussion," Margaret said, "I have a disclosure and personnel matter for the attention." She nodded to the screen. First slide. Primary attendance records, 6 weeks, sorted by shift. Second slide, the system access log. 11 edits, 6 weeks, 1 administrator account. Third slide, the account name, Gerald A. Price. "That log could have been spoofed," Price said. His voice was very controlled. "Any IT administrator could have tagged those edits to my credentials." Fourth slide. Roy LeBlanc's notebook, photographed page by page. Times, block print handwriting. 3 late arrivals cross-referenced to 3 20-hour shifts. Fifth slide, a corporate filing. A Delaware-registered logistics company, a 12% undisclosed shareholder, Gerald A. Circsenchul, said. He was no longer smiling. The door at the back of the boardroom opened. Thomas came in first in the same green work jacket, the kind of jacket that did not belong in a boardroom and was entirely unmistakable. Behind him came Roy LeBlanc in his dock supervisor vest, freshly pressed. Behind Roy came Dr. Constance Alder, who had stepped out to the hallway 6 minutes earlier and said she had a phone call to make. She did not sit. She stood at the back of the room and addressed the board without raising her voice. Roy LeBlanc served 28 years on the docks of 3 Canadian ports. His testimony regarding the attendance and shift records of Master Corporal Thomas Holt, under whose operational supervision LeBlanc worked at CFB Trenton for 2 years, is to me a document. I will provide written attestation to that effect before I leave this building. 2 board members on Price's left placed their hands flat on the table and turned to look at him. He stood. He opened his mouth. He closed it. The vote took 6 minutes. 10-2, termination for cause. The corporate counsel walked to Price's side of the table and asked quietly for his building pass. Price looked at Margaret. He did not say what he had planned to say. He set his pass on the table. He walked out. Betta Szymanski was standing in the doorway as he passed. She did not look at him. She walked into the room and set a folder on the table in front of Margaret, the complete raw personnel file for Thomas Holt, every page, every commendation, everything she had kept carefully recoverable for the day someone with the authority to ask finally did. Thomas had stayed near the back wall throughout. When the room had emptied, he looked at Margaret across the length of the polished table. She looked back. She nodded once. He nodded back. The 2 board members, still collecting their papers, did not see it. They were talking about lunch. Gerald Price was gone, but neither of them said anything about what that meant or what came next, because neither of them quite knew yet. 6 weeks passed. February. Then March, and then the particular Canadian morning when you first notice the ice on the sidewalk has begun to lose its confidence. Thomas was reinstated as dock operations lead, 2 grades above his previous position. He kept driving the same truck. He kept eating lunch in the break room with Roy and the freight handlers. Roy's notebook now sat in a small display case in the corridor outside the operations office, where Margaret had put it with a brass plate and no explanation. On the second Saturday in March, June had her second-grade art showcase at the community center on Lower Water Street. There were 12 pieces displayed around the gymnasium. 3 of them were June's. June had mailed the invitation herself, using the printer at school and a stamp she had borrowed from her teacher, addressed to Ms. Margaret Voss, care of Caldwell Freight, 14th floor. In small letters at the bottom of the invitation she had written, "P.S. Please don't tell Dad." Margaret arrived 8 minutes early. She wore her camel coat, cleaned and relined since the night of the freezing rain. Thomas saw her from across the gymnasium. His face did the thing it did. That slight pause, not surprise but acknowledgement, like a person marking an arrival they had been quietly, privately expecting. He did not walk over, June did. June took her hand and led her to the wall. The first drawing was a dog named Gerald. The second was the lighthouse from the school project. The third was new, a backyard in winter. A man in a green jacket, a small girl, and a woman standing at the edge of the yard with one hand slightly extended, as though she had just stepped through a gate. June did not say who the woman was. Margaret did not ask. After the showcase, they walked along the waterfront boardwalk. Thomas kept his hands in his coat pockets. The harbor was gray-green, beginning to break up at the edges. They walked for 35 minutes and spoke perhaps 10 sentences, most of them about the ferry schedule. And the fact that June had found what she claimed was a fossilized shell in the ice near the pier, which Thomas had examined carefully and identified as a piece of broken ceramic which June found equally interesting. At one point June ran ahead toward the water, and Thomas watched her and said, half to himself, her mom loved the harbor in winter, said it looked like pewter. He did not say anything else for a long time. Margaret did not ask him to. Near the parking lot at the end of the boardwalk, Margaret reached into her bag and brought out his work jacket, cleaned and folded. Thomas looked at it. He looked at her. He took it from her hands. He turned it over once. Then he put it back in her arms. "Keep it," he said. March in Halifax is still February. She didn't argue. June came running back, breathless, reporting that the shell ceramic had survived the ice and was going to live on the bathroom windowsill. Thomas scooped her up and she wrapped her arms around his neck and then pointed over his shoulder back at Margaret. "Is she coming for soup?" Thomas set June down. He looked at Margaret. He almost said something. He didn't. He just nodded, the small nod she had seen in the office the morning of the termination, on the shoulder of the McKay Bridge, across the boardroom on the morning Price's pass was taken from the table. She nodded back. The three of them walked to his truck. By the first week of April, the snow on Gottingen Street had melted into the gutters, and the trees along the block were putting out small, cautious leaves. Thomas had moved June into a rented house in the North End with a narrow backyard and a fence he was fixing on Sundays. June had a proper bedroom with a window that looked out at the yard, and she had placed her 7 dog drawings along the windowsill in order of rank, Gerald at the center. On a Sunday in early April, Margaret arrived at 11 with a small red maple sapling in a burlap sack. June had texted her on Wednesday, "Dad says you're good at picking things. We need a tree for the yard, the kind that goes red. He says you'll know which one." Margaret had spent 2 hours at a nursery in Dartmouth, asking careful questions. The man behind the counter had helped her pick the sturdiest one they had. They planted it in the southwest corner of the yard where it would get afternoon sun. June patted the soil down around the base with both hands and then stood up and looked at it with the satisfaction of someone who has planted something and already knows what it will become. Thomas was washing dishes in the kitchen. He watched through the window. Constance Alder had stepped down from the board in February. At her retirement dinner, she had found a quiet moment near the end of the evening and touched Margaret briefly on the arm. "Your father made good choices," she said. "You're making better ones." In the backyard, June straightened up and looked at Margaret. "Are you staying?" she asked. Margaret looked toward the kitchen window. Thomas was drying his hands on a dish towel. He met her eyes through the glass. He gave a small nod. She nodded back. They ate dinner at the round table in the small kitchen. Thomas sliced bread. June told a long story about a substitute teacher who had pronounced her last name 4 different ways in one day, each more confident than the last. Margaret passed the butter without being asked and refilled June's water glass when it was getting low. There was a candle on the table that Thomas had not lit. June had lit it before dinner. She had said it made the food look warmer. The light was ordinary and yellow, and it caught the rim of each dish and made the whole table look like something. Nobody said anything important. Nobody needed to. After dinner, June climbed onto Margaret's lap without negotiating it and turned her back and said she needed her hair braided. Margaret had not braided anyone's hair in years. She did it anyway. It was uneven. June checked it in the dark window above the sink and announced it was good. Thomas sat across the table and said nothing. He watched his niece and this woman at his kitchen table in the candlelight, and he said nothing at all. And the nothing was not an absence but a kind of fullness that none of them had the vocabulary for yet. No one said the words. No one called it anything. June blew out the candle before bed because she had lit it, and that made it hers to put out. Outside, in the southwest corner of the yard, the red maple stood in new soil, with the night air around it and the first suggestion of buds on its 3 small branches. None of them had been watching when it began. That was the reason they could trust it was real.